Welcome back. You tuned into Afternoon Enlightenment with me, your host Mariam Mia. And now it's time for our Ramadan. It's become a Ramadan weekly special, educational special, empowering and enlightening segment that is on contextualizing Zakah within Islamic finance. And joining me again, my beloved and kindred sister, Fayruz Mohamed, National Chairperson of SANZAF. And all the way from Cape Town. I wonder if it's a sunny Cape Town because it's a cloudy, beautiful Gauteng today. So let's just find out what's happening in the mother city with Sister Fayruz. Assalamu alaikum, Fayruz, and welcome to our Afternoon Enlightenment here on Salam Media.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Mu'allima. How are you doing? The weather in Cape Town is beautiful, mashallah. It's not too hot and it's not too cold and no wind, alhamdulillah.
Oh, so the wind machine is closed. I'm told you have it at Cape Point. It's the wind machine. Somebody once told me about it. So it's resting today, mashallah. But Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you can go ahead. Today we're going to be discussing something very important, that is zakatable assets, because last week we excluded the non-zakatable assets and we spoke of that. So today, inshallah, I think the focus should be on all our zakatable assets.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursaleen. Sayyidina wa biyana wa maulana Muhammadin ajma'een. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Shukran, Mu'allima. Yes, last week we covered, the conditions of zakah. We covered some of the non-zakatable assets. But I think I may just want to recap very quickly. If you go to the first slides, in terms of what conditions need to be present before zakah is due on one's wealth. And when we look at those four conditions, the one is ownership, which means that you absolutely need to own the wealth before any zakah is due. The next one is that of growth. So when it comes to growth, the asset needs to lend itself to grow or physically grow. And then we came to the third one, which is nisab. And this is the minimum net surplus zakatable wealth you need to own before zakah is due on your wealth. And that nisab, which is then the fourth condition, is that it needs to be held for at least 12 Islamic lunar months. So I may just want to reiterate, Mu'allima, that we mentioned that zakah is not a tax. It is an act of ibadah, meaning that it stems, from us trying to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and with that, purify our hearts from greed or stinginess, and obviously in terms of not holding on to any, material wealth. And that ultimately all wealth belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We also said that, our guidance comes from Quran and Sunnah, as well as the interpretation of jurists, in terms of, obviously there will be differing opinions. So if there is a differing opinion, we'll highlight that. But I do encourage you to speak to your sheikh or to your mufti, just to clarify that and make sure that it applies to you. So coming right into it, in terms of zakatable assets, when we move on, we'd just like to say that, when we speak...
Sister Fayruz, we're getting an interference from your side. It's echoing there. So what we're going to do is let's just take a short break while our technical people sort out the gremlins on your line, and then we can get back into it.
And stay ahead with Salam Media. This is Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
You tuned into Salam Media, and let's see if we've got Sister Fayruz back. Fayruz, can you hear me?
I can. Mu'allima, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, alhamdulillah, mashallah, alhamdulillah. Let's just make dua. It holds up. You can continue.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I think I started with the next slide.
That's correct.
Just gave a quick illustration in terms of, what we actually, when we speak about zakatable assets, what needs to be in this basket of ours. And it's a category of personal assets. When I say personal asset in terms of your personal capacity, it would be in your business capacity, as well as if you have a share in any assets in a P2Y, CC or partnership. So this is just a quick example to say that if, for example, your net zakatable assets is 30,000 Rand in your personal capacity, 100,000 in your business capacity, and if you have a share in a partnership, for example, and that is 60,000, then your total net zakatable assets would be 190,000 times 2.5%, and your Zakat due would be 4,750. So that's just a very quick overview of, that Zakat due would be on all assets that you own, personal, business, as well as a share. So when we move on to the next slide, so these are the various categories of zakatable assets one could own. So a layman's person like yourself and I would own liquid assets like money, gold, and silver, debtors, for example, and that would be at 2.5%. We also have livestock, for example, like sheep, cows, and camels, and this would be possibly at 5%. And then we have agricultural products like wheat, barley, dates, etc. And this is generally at harvest, and it can be either 5% or 10%, depending on your irrigation system. And then we also have minerals, which includes crude oil, gas, etc. And this is at extraction at 20%. So this is just to give you a broad view of the different zakatable assets you could own, but just to indicate that there are different nisabs, different holds, and different rates. So let's get into just, the liquid assets that, we could own. So we'll look at very briefly on money, listed shares, and unit trusts. We'll look at some policies, retirement savings, which we covered last week. We'll speak about gold and silver and jewelry, which is very topical for our women. And then we'll just cover very short business assets. So when we speak about zakah on money, so what would that include? So when we look at the next slide, it includes all forms of cash. So it would be all forms of currencies, whether they are South African currency. And, when people go on Umrah, alhamdulillah, they always tend to, keep those dollars, in a safe place, because inshallah, when they go again, it has to be, you need to ensure that you include all foreign currency, just obviously translated on the date of your calculation date, and all bank accounts, savings, check, fixed deposits, etc. And just make sure that you exclude any interest from those bank accounts. Maybe just to say, in terms of, people generally ask the question, does it also include Hajj funds?
And I was just about to ask you that. What about our Hajj funds, or even those funds for bucket list travel and that you've put in away?
Yes, alhamdulillah. Sometimes people, they save towards, like you just indicate, some travel vacation, or they may want to save towards, buying a particular asset or a car. If that cash is equal to or more than the nisab, and you've held it for at least 12 months, which means if you've paid zakah last year, then whatever you have in your bank account, including the Hajj money, including, the funds that you're keeping for some bucket list, for example, that has to be included as part of your zakatable wealth on the date of your calculation. So even if it's for Hajj, it doesn't matter what the purpose of why you're holding that cash, it will be zakatable. So moving on in terms of zakah on listed shares and unit trusts, this is just to say, when we have listed shares, it's generally when we hold shares, for example, in a listed company. And technically, what you're holding is a share in a company. So basically, you're holding shares of a company's assets. However, only those zakatable assets in that company would be zakatable, not all assets of that particular company. However, if I'm doing my calculation today and I'm holding shares in a listed company, it'd be very difficult for me to find out, what are those zakatable assets balances, and because those companies generally only, complete the balance sheet once in a year, and we do our calculation throughout the year. So what we then recommend is that take the market value of those shares, if they are listed companies, because it'll be very difficult for you to calculate, what those zakatable assets are at any point in time. So that we then recommend take the market value of those shares, and you'll be able to then easily get that from a broker. When we speak about employee share schemes, this is where, for example, you are employed at a company, and for some sort of retention purposes, they would give you shares of the company. However, they want to somehow put conditions to those shares, and well, there usually are conditions attached to them so that you can obviously stay at this company for a period of time. While there are conditions attached to these shares, you do not pay zakah on them, because you won't be able to freely do with these shares as you please. Only once you have the vested right in these shares, which means there are no conditions attached to it, you can sell it or do whatever you want with it, you will then only be liable to pay zakah on it. Just remember, when we're talking about shares, if you have any intention of trading with these shares, obviously it would then be at market value, because then they would be regarded as stock. But if it's a long-term investment, you'd obviously have a different objective of it. However, you can then have to calculate it at market value as well, because you wouldn't have, those accountable assets values easily available. So next we speak about zakah on policies. So yeah, Malima, yeah, most
Yes, and I
conventional
want to ask
policies
you,
are
besides
impermissible.
besides our policies, what about those education policies? We take out for our children. Who pays? Is it theirs? Who owns those policies? First of all, if we take it out for children, we're paying it. Who pays for them? And if they're not yet baligh, then what is the implication here? Because I think that's a confusing for myself, and I think most of us who take it. Those education
Bismillah
policies.
Rahim. Yes, Ma'alima. So when it comes to educational policies, which is generally an endowment policy, is where, say, for example, lots of us moms, would want to save towards our children's education. So here we contribute monthly towards this policy. However, the policy is not in our name, which means it's usually in the name of the child. And because of that, we as the contributor, we the ones that contributing towards this policy, will never benefit from this policy. So in our hands, it is just a normal monthly expenditure that we're contributing towards this policy. But when we're looking at in the name of, the beneficiary of this policy, and usually it's in the name of the child. So who, does the child actually have to pay zakah on this policy? And here we look at wealth of minors. And here we have differing views when it comes to wealth of minors. When we speak about the Shafi'i view, so the Shafi'i view is that you do pay zakah on wealth of minors because all human beings are in need of purification. Thus, from a Shafi'i perspective, you will pay zakah on wealth of minors. However, when it comes to Imam Abu Hanifa, he is of the view that you do not pay zakah on the wealth of minors, because when it comes to minors, they need an intention to pay. And the pen is lifted, they say, for three individuals: the one that sleeps until he awakens, the one that is insane until he regains insanity, and the one that is a minor until he reaches puberty. So for Hanafi followers, you do not pay zakah on the wealth of minors until they become baligh. But when they reach puberty, and so too for Imam Shafi'i, the guardian is responsible to make sure that the zakah is then being paid, because obviously even when they reach puberty, they may still be of an age, for example, 10. If you look at young ladies, they're obviously not at the means to be able to calculate it. It then becomes a responsibility of us as parents, as guardians, to calculate that zakah. Shukran, Mu'alima. But when we speak about conventional policies, just going back in terms of the slide, I just want to mention that most conventional policies are impermissible. They are not Sharia compliant. And we sometimes of the view that because they're not Sharia compliant, we do not pay zakah on them. However, you must understand, that the contributions that you make towards these policies are from halal earnings, which means your money that you've earned will always remain halal. So the contributions that you make to this fund policy, to this non-Sharia compliant policy, will always be zakatable. So here we look at the lesser of the value between your contributions and the value of the fund. So very quick example. So you've been contributing for the last 2 years, for example, to this non-Sharia compliant policy. So your contributions added up to 24,000 Rand. So when you're doing your calculation, you now see what the value of this fund policy is, and you see that it's 30,000 Rand. You now have to take the lesser of the two. So the contributions you've made thus far has been 24,000 Rand. So the 24,000 Rand will be zakatable. The 6,000 Rand is what we call non-permissible income. You have to discharge and dispose of that income because you can never benefit from this policy. So you may need to look at, why would you be contributing towards a non-Sharia compliant policy if you'll never be able to benefit from this policy? However, if you're looking at the date of your calculation, and the policy is actually reduced to 20,000 Rand. So your contributions is 24,000, but your policy value is 20,000. What you now need to calculate zakah on is on the 20,000 Rand, which is the lesser between the contributions and the non-Sharia compliant policy. So just be reminded that even if you're contributing towards a non-Sharia compliant policy, the contributions will be zakatable between the lesser of the contributions or the fund policy. And then we obviously get to Sharia compliant fund policies. those would be at market related, or in terms of the surrender value. Because they're Sharia compliant, it would obviously just be whatever the fund value would be at that time. Now we come to retirement savings, pension funds, and provident funds. So we briefly spoke about it last week, Malima. So I don't know if you want me to go into it again.
So no, we
maybe-
did it. We dealt with it quite comprehensive last week, in terms of you explained the retirement annuity that was from your own voluntary savings, as opposed
Yes.
to the ones that you don't have a choice,
Compulsory.
because it's compulsory
Yes.
from the company. So I think we've got it there, and for all our viewers, you can check last week's slide, last week's conversation, because the Sister Fayruz covered it quite comprehensively.
Shukran, Malima. So we'll then move on, or maybe before we move on, we did speak about preservation fund. So preservation fund is, for example, where you resign from your employment or you get retrenched. So what happens here is that your pension or provident fund would then be released from this fund policy. And when we look at certain conditions of preservation funds, you will then have access to 1/3 of this pension or provident fund, and 2/3 will be locked in, where you will receive as an annuity. So when you have access to this 1/3, if you withdraw this 1/3 and you use it for whatever purpose, maybe you perform umrah, or you distribute it to your children, or whatever you do with it, for example, whatever you have left in your possession on the date of your calculation, you will pay zakah on that value, irrespective of you not having it for 12 months. So if you paid zakah last year, because remember, it is the nisab that needs to be held for 12 months, not the wealth specifically, the various categories of wealth. So even if you've received the 1/3 2 or 3 months before your calculation date, as long as you've paid zakah last year, you will pay zakah on whatever you have in your possession. But if you've never paid zakah before, and now, alhamdulillah, you have this lump sum of wealth in your possession, if today is the date you've received this preservation 1/3 from this lump sum, you will only be liable to pay zakah on your wealth in 12 months' time from today. So if today is the 18th Ramadan, for example, you won't pay zakah today because you've never held nisab before. Today would be your whole date. And next year, on the 18th of Ramadan, on 1445, you will now see what you have left from your 1/3, as well as what you have left on all other savings. You will then pay zakah on all of that together, times 2.5%. So just be reminded that you need to look at what you have in your possession on the date of your calculation, including whatever you have left on the preservation fund. If you, for example, Mu'alima, decide not to withdraw the 1/3, because some people, may not actually need the cash, and they then decide that they want to preserve this wealth, including the 2/3. If you decide not to access this 1/3, what happens now is that because you had access to this 1/3, you will be liable to pay zakah on this 1/3 every single year, net of taxes. So just be reminded that if you decide to withdraw it, you'll use it and whatever is left in your possession. If you decide to leave it and preserve it together with the 2/3, you will be liable for the 1/3 that's left in your preservation fund, net of taxes, every single year, as long as you've met all the conditions of zakah.
We're talking about zakah on gold, silver, and our jewelry, because I think that's the calculation that stresses, especially us females, the most every year when it's time to pay zakah. It's how much, or what's the value of our gold and jewelry, and what do I pay on? So let's be empowered and educated to ensure that we are paying our zakah correctly on our gold, silver, and other jewelry. Over to you, Mu'alima Fayruz.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Shukran, Mu'alima. I'm not a Mu'alima, but
Well, you're educating us, so in my books you are, no Mu'alima.
Jazakallah for the thought. So when it comes to gold, silver, and specifically jewelry, this is very topical for us women, alhamdulillah. So there are differing views when it comes to the jewelry part. However, when it comes to gold and silver, there is no difference of opinion. Gold and silver in its true form is zakatable. So if you look at that block of gold, if you look at gold Kruger coins, those are zakatable because they are usually held as investment or for investment purposes. And we need to ensure that we pay our gold, or at least zakah on our gold correctly, because it's obviously based on weight. When it comes to personal jewelry, so this is where the differing views come in. So the one view is of the Hanafi madhab, where you pay zakah on all personal gold and silver jewelry. So it's only gold and silver personal jewelry. Remember, we mentioned the last time that there is no zakah on platinum or palladium, etc., even though they're more valued than gold and silver, because the Prophet ﷺ hasn't mentioned, those kind of metals. We only pay zakah on gold and silver. And here, when we speak about personal jewelry, so when it comes to Hanafi madhab, you pay on all gold and silver. So it doesn't matter whether it's personal jewelry, for example, you will pay on personal jewelry inclusively as well. For the Shafi, Hanbali, and the Maliki madhahib, there's a differing view in that you do not pay zakah on personal jewelry that is used for adornment. Obviously, if you're in a jewelry making business and you're selling jewelry, then obviously that would be regarded as your stock, and you will pay zakah on that kind of jewelry. But when we speak to specifically just of personal jewelry, you do not pay zakah on personal jewelry when it comes to the Shafi and Hanbali and Maliki views. Hanafi view, you pay on personal jewelry as well, including gold and silver.
Okay, so it depends on the madhab you're following. You need to then check with your alim, your ulama, your mufti, in terms of the personal ones, what constitutes personal ones, and whether it's zakatable. So we will leave the fiqh questions to the the Islamic jurisprudence and our sheikhs, and we can move on with the next slide.
Alima, just to say in terms of, how do they actually calculate, this jewelry? So maybe we'd recommend them taking it to a reputable jeweler, because what the jeweler is going to do is the jeweler is going to take the weight of the gold or silver only, because most of our jewelry has, it has precious stones, may have pearls, it may have diamonds, for example. The jeweler will specifically exclude that, and the jeweler will give you the rate of the various, or not the rate, the weight of the various carats of gold. So, you get 14, you get 22, you get 24 carats of gold, and the rates for each of those carats are different. So make sure that, you jot down these weights just once, because you're only going to have to, weigh your gold once every year. You don't have to, or at least you just need to weigh it once. What you need to do every year is get the rate of each carat for gold, and that would determine then what your value of your weight would be. So you only do it once, and then you just keep that on the record, and you just change the rate per carat every year, inshallah. So moving on, Mu'alima, just in terms of, zakah on business assets, and like, we may have discussed before during this time of
Sister Fayruz, we have many questions as well on zakat of business assets, and time is caught up with us. Can we then defer or delay the zakat on business assets for next week, and we can discuss that, because I think there's a lot of this in terms of your tools of trade. Do you do this? And then stock
Yes.
as well, and the value. How do you value stock? Maybe that was 2 years ago you had, now to the current value. So there are many questions. So what we'll do is, inshallah, let's hold on to this, and shukran for that calculation, because as you mentioned, precious stones and diamonds are not included, and we know our rings are mixed with a mixture of gold and the precious stones. So important to take it to the reputable jewelers, and like you say, get the calculations, the weight as well as the type of gold, because 14, 21, and 24 carats have different values because it's different content of gold. So shukran for this, and looking forward next week to the conversation. So we will continue firstly with zakah on business assets as well. But very important what you said in the first slide is, irrespective of whether it's a business or your personal, we need to pay zakat on the totality of our wealth on the day that the nisab is due, or your whole period on that day. So it's the totality of what you own that is zakatable. Shukran for this. Looking forward to connecting with yourself or Sister Yasmina next week, inshallah. And may you be under the mercy and protection of the Almighty.
Ameen, Ya Rab. Jazakallah so much, Mu'alima. and honored to have you invited me on your session. Jazakallah.
Ameen,
Wassalamu
Ameen.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. That was Sister Fayruz Mohamed. She's the chairperson of SANZAF. And yes, SANZAF also has on there, please download the SANZAF app, because on the SANZAF app, they have a Zakah calculator. So it makes things so much easy in terms of ensuring that you pay, you have the opportunity to calculate and pay your Zakat correctly in fulfilling a very vital third pillar of Islam, that is contributing to the pool of zakah. We're going to take a short break, and then we come back. We're going to be discussing the cemeteries and the upkeep of the West Park and Nuclear Cemetery, as well as a bit of history on the Nuclear Cemetery with three brothers from FMYO. All this after the break.